Out of all of the impressive aspects of Kagurabachi, the creation of Genichi Sojo, the first main antagonist of the series, still stands as one of the most notable feats of efficient writing I've seen not only from this manga, but many other battle shonen in a long time. From his introduction in chapter 5 to his demise in chapter 18, Sojo was able to quickly become a villain that I wanted to see more of due to his charisma and connection with Chihiro and what seems to be formulating as the main theme of the story. In this video, I want to talk about Sojo as an antagonist a little bit, singing his praises not only as a character, but also examining the skillful writing of Takeru Hokazono. The ability to write such a compelling and entertaining villain in such a short time frame is an impressive one that I'd like to discuss and explain. Now, in order to make clear why Sojo's character quality pound for pound is so impressive, let me put this into context using a couple of other series. In the first 18 chapters of Naruto, the closest thing to an antagonist with a complete journey was Mizuki. At this point in the manga, Team 7 had only fought Zabuza once, and while Haku was introduced, he wasn't the well-rounded and multi-dimensional character that we know him as today. In fact, I would argue that Haku and Zabuza both became truly interesting, well-written, fully fleshed out antagonists just as the arc reached its conclusion in the 31st chapter of the manga. Series like Bleach and One Piece were even further off from creating their first really good antagonist due to their pacing, with Uryu only being introduced as an antagonist in chapter 34 and becoming a character worthy of being considered good, at least in my eyes, after the conclusion of the fight against the Menos in chapter 50. You could argue a few of the hollows like Grand Fisher serve well within their role before these chapters, but when broadening the discussion beyond being a simple wall for Ichigo to overcome to an antagonist force with a bit more of a fleshed out dynamic with him personally, I truly find Uryu to be the first major example. Even if we were to use the Grand Fisher fight, we'd see that Ichigo versus Grand Fisher ended in chapter 24, being 6 chapters after the conclusion of Sojo's conflict with Chihiro. One Piece basically takes the same approach as Naruto and Bleach, going for a longer running, more overarching approach, but just delays this process even more so in favor of world building and tonal establishment. Arlong would be the first character that would meet the standards set in this video, and not just dismissed like some villain of the week. And the very beginning of his arc only starts 60 plus chapters into the story, with it largely being concluded just short of the 100 chapter mark. Now, I'm not saying Kagurabachi is better than these manga in every regard. I'm not even saying that overall it has better antagonists than Naruto, Bleach, and One Piece, but using these examples to demonstrate how quickly and efficiently Sojo was crafted helps add much needed context to the writing feat that Hokazono pulled off. It is not easy or simple to do something this impressive this quickly, and even when using a faster paced, newer manga like Jujutsu Kaisen, we can see that within 18 chapters, Sukuna was the closest thing to being a compelling antagonist. And while he was certainly a force of nature with a charismatic personality much like Sojo, he lacked the punch of a conclusion or obvious overarching thematic dynamic with the protagonist as Sojo did. Now, Mahito pretty quickly fills that spot upon his introduction and first fight with Itadori, although that only happens after chapter 31. Needless to say, Kagurabachi is impressive for pulling this off, and the series as a whole benefits from this greatly. Now, the key components for being a good villain will vary depending on the genre, intended tone, themes, stylistic preferences, and specific series that you're talking about. But generally speaking, I think there are 5 things that Sojo and many other antagonists do that make them compelling and allow them to stand a few tiers above the riffraff or villain of the week kind of antagonist. Making a good first impression, having a powerful and captivating screen presence, participating in and contributing to good fights, resolving or concluding narrative and thematic beats in the story, and above all else, having a strong and substantive relationship with the protagonist and what they are meant to represent within their given story. The nature of this relationship will vary from manga to manga, anime to anime, novel to novel, but it's important that the audience feels like the protagonist and antagonist have a reason to stand against each other in the way that they do. And alongside this relationship, all of the aforementioned criteria are important in crafting a good villain. Now, the first requirement is arguably the least important in the long run, but for a manga like Kagurabachi that was on a time limit to get attention, to get sales, to get traction, a powerful introduction for a villain is crucial. And many of our favorite characters, villains or otherwise, have a really strong first impression or big moment that gets us to be intrigued by them. Sojo's first on-screen moment being him in a hot tub looking at one of his lackeys being strung up in front of him is something that I would say fits the bill. Now, I wouldn't call this a particularly badass moment for him, but I would say it's very attention grabbing and pretty quickly shows us much of what we need to know regarding Sojo's basic demeanor. It's clear that he takes pleasure in, or at least doesn't mind the cruelty of his actions, as he's as comfortable as can be while trying to glean some information from one of his goons. I can personally say that this worked as a decent attention grabber, but wasn't enough to fully convince me to invest in Sojo. The hook was bobbing up and down in the water, but Hokazono hadn't properly placed the bait until Sojo decides to get his own hands dirty. Sojo's brutal execution of Daruma the Sorcerer and his entire family doesn't count as his initial introduction, but it certainly is the first display of his ruthlessness and cold, charismatic persona. Rather than be just some average sorcerer we'd seen Chihiro face so far, there's a very distinct cruelty in his actions that forcibly brings attention to himself. Through his evil nature, through his dramatic nature, Sojo shines a light on himself so bright that no one reading the story can ignore. The way Sojo sets this whole scene up for maximum violence and turmoil just makes that light shining on him even larger, even brighter, and even harsher, and what makes it more cutthroat is the fact that his victims won't even know that he did that. It was an act made purely out of malice or potential curiosity. Forcing the Daruma sorcerer to end his own sister's life to prove a small point that only he would understand really sets a tone, and his dialogue following it allows us to see what Sojo might value as a person. If you've chosen a path in life, at least commit one measly lifetime to it. From this single line, it's pretty clear that Sojo's a very dedicated, or at least focused character. While not steadfast in the same way as Chihiro, his disdain for Norisaku's lack of commitment is palpable, and it continues to be contextualized throughout his journey in the manga. At the time, we don't know this, but Sojo's dedication to the enchanted blades and Kunishige's perceived philosophy is something that he's more than willing to kill for, and in the end, die for. Much like Chihiro, the blades of Rokuhira mean the world to him, so he's obviously willing to commit to that path, a path of power, violence, and destruction, a path that he's more than willing to commit one measly lifetime to. In this way, Sojo's first real moment of action serves to set up his dynamic with Chihiro unbeknownst to us, as well as solidify him as a real threat who poses danger beyond the random fodder we've seen our protagonist fight up to this point. Sojo is different, and that is conveyed quite clearly and concisely. Within the span of this very chapter, we see Sojo kill another underling of his, not out of some duty, spite, or even anger, but to specifically get warmed up for his battle with Chihiro, to properly prepare to do battle with another sacred blade. We get to see just how powerful of an opponent Sojo will prove to be, as even after getting hit by the same trauma sorcery that put Chihiro flat on his ass, Sojo continues choking out his opponent and quickly cuts them down before pulling up on Chihiro and heating up the moment that he finds another sacred blade, demonstrating to us for the first time what he looks like when he gets heated. Sojo's first encounter with Chihiro checks off many of the boxes that I think exist for a good villain. His excitement to fight another enchanted blade user shines through in a different but equally interesting way to his cold exterior before. The fight, while short-lived, is another instance in which Hokazono gets to show off his love for interesting perspectives and powerful paneling, and in this one chapter, a pretty strong dynamic between the two characters is established explicitly. Of all of these things though, it's his relationship with Chihiro, Kunishige, and the enchanted blades themselves that catches my attention the most. We've already seen evidence that implies his dedication at this point, but finally getting it pointed in a direction that we could understand was integral to comprehending Sojo that much more, and also gave us some insight into why Hokazono chose to write him as Chihiro's first big villain. The foundation of Kagurabachi is built entirely on Chihiro's love for his father, his blades, and his legacy. He certainly has a good sense of what's right and wrong, and by all accounts, Chihiro's a very good person, but the impetus for this story is one of vengeance and retrieval. To cut down those who slayed his father and keep the enchanted blades he toiled over in his grasp is his main objective. So to have an outsider like Sojo claim to love his father while also spitting in the face of everything he stood for is grounds for pure hatred. Sojo's very existence is like a defilement and perversion of everything Kunishige stood for in Chihiro's mind, and wielding Cloud Gouger for purposes other than protection is even worse. On Sojo's end, he's facing another boring person who doesn't grasp what Kunishige truly wanted. Much like Chihiro, Sojo views himself as the only living being who truly understood Kunishige, inherently invalidating Chihiro's ideology and worthiness of the blade he wields. Now, Sojo's immaturity is quite easy to spot in the moment, or rather, his lack of information on Chihiro's personal background leads him to speaking in a way that shows his ignorance. To say the very son of Kunishige didn't understand him is quite absurd, and if in this moment you saw Chihiro as the truly correct one, I wouldn't be able to blame you. Not only is Sojo clearly a cruel and villainous person, but through flashbacks, we also know that Kunishige wanted his blade to protect people, end a war quickly, and not be used again for the sake of personal or political gain. From his own mouth, we hear these words. We know them to be true. If you're a particularly clever and observant reader, however, you'd also know that much of what Sojo is saying is also correct. Chihiro's quick dismissal of his viewpoints for the sake of his own perspective, while understandable, isn't quite true to the entirety of what his father told him. Did Kunishige want his sword to protect people? Of course. But swords are, above all else, tools for killing and cutting. A sword that cannot cut cannot kill, and a sword that cannot kill is no sword at all. By creating blades that can wield such power in the first place, intentionally or not, Kunishige was endorsing the death, violence, and destruction of whoever or whatever the wielder desired at that moment. Sojo bringing to light the fact that a sword's purpose is to kill isn't wrong and isn't something that Kunishige didn't understand and acknowledge. These two contradictory truths converge and clash, much like Chihiro and Sojo themselves. In the first battle, neither character is able to yield any ground or accept the other's perspective. They are unable to separate the aspects they deem acceptable of Kunishige from the person that he was in his entirety. In fact, they are only able to fully come to grips with their opposing truths in their second clash, after N10 and Cloud Gouger come to accept them as wielders, only after both of them grow through their struggle. Very true to their characters, Chihiro discovers new blade abilities through his desire to protect Char and use his sword for good, while Sojo continues to develop and grow when he discards everything else for death and destruction. Neither path is the only path that can be taken to properly use one of these enchanted blades, because they both hold equal validity from a purely pragmatic standpoint. Hokazono even goes out of his way to show artistic parallels between the two as they awaken their blades in the midst of combat. And funnily enough, they both learn from each other in terms of their respective power-ups and moments of growth. By hitting his opponent with a barrage of 20 small and quick attacks, Chihiro is able to become significantly more destructive and effective at killing than before. While he may not have applied any specific blade techniques that Sojo used in their fight with N10, I find it fascinating that what changed in this moment was not his illusory abilities, but his capacity for overwhelming violence like the person he despises so much. Conversely, Sojo was able to increase his combat prowess exponentially by cloaking himself in the built-up lightning instead of discharging it, taking inspiration not only from Chihiro's part-time gig as a lightning rod, but also Nishiki, which allows for a statistical amplification through spiritual energy cloaking. Once again, Sojo's proficiency with the blade demonstrates his worthiness to wield it, or at least his own viewpoint having a foundation worth standing upon. Although indirectly, in that moment, he overcame Chihiro's own relationship with Kunishige because he defeated the knowledge that Chihiro had access to strictly because of his own familiar relationship. The bond he had with his father wasn't severed, but through his own interpretations and explorations of Kunishige, Sojo was able to prove in his fight against the Kaminabe that being Kunishige's son alone didn't entitle him to be more correct in this stance. This is something that becomes clear in chapter 17, the decisive battle between Genichi Sojo and Chihiro Rokuhira. The final battle between Chihiro and Sojo is a very climactic one. The dynamic between these two really comes to a head here, with both coming to understand that the other's viewpoint can exist while still fighting to kill and demonstrate their own correctness. Well, it's a hard pill to swallow for Chihiro especially, knowing that someone like Sojo could wield his father's blades for evil and still be accepted by them only strengthens his resolve to cut him down with thicker bloodlust. Hokazono showing this understanding by having Chihiro and Sojo both sitting down and having a meal together was such a cool visual metaphor, and the discussion that they have only coming to fruition through the clashing of their blades is such samurai shit that I couldn't help but read this whole chapter with a smile on my face. As soon as I saw that, I knew Hokazono had this conclusion in the bag. I haven't really gotten the chance to talk about Sojo's fights all that much, at least not the surface level visual aspect of them, mostly because the narrative and thematic weight behind his relationship with Chihiro is significantly more important, but considering how cool this final battle is, I think it's appropriate to at least briefly touch on the subject. In general, Kagurabachi fights are really good. Hokazono is extremely competent at crafting dynamic poses for the characters battling and using perspective to give the audience a very cinematic angle in everything that goes on during these conflicts. You can see it in the first Sojo and Chihiro battle for sure, but his dramatic framing improved exponentially in the 13 chapter span he was drawing because everything about Chihiro versus Sojo's rematch was more engaging than their first fight. The anticipation and build-up in chapter 16 as these two stare each other down, both bloodied and beaten, both determined to cut the person standing before them down with violence. The narrator making it explicit the states that these two fighters are in. The tension that is building up the entire chapter, the parallel paneling as they both tighten their hold on their blades, and then the battle begins with 12 seconds on the clock. And quick aside, but I just love when manga do this little timed fight thing. I don't see it that often, but when I do, it's just so cool. It's such a sick tool to demonstrate how quick these fighters are moving. It's so sick to see these characters depicted in a way that makes even the passage of time seem slow, all while giving us an extra layer of tension to see exactly how they'll use their limited time to finish off their opponent. And having Sojo have the amount of time remaining because he doubled the amount of spirit energy he was cloaking himself in was just genius. But anyways, specific tangent aside, this entire battle is thrilling from start to finish. Multiple insane spreads where Hokazono can truly flex his artistic ability, a good mix of narration and internal dialogue, and a really strategic play on Chihiro's part at the end of the fight, showing that he's been paying attention to Sojo and learned from him in more ways than one. All of these aspects of the fight and more create the breathtaking atmosphere that was Chihiro versus Sojo. That final slash cutting through Cloud Gouger, the surrounding environment, and Sojo himself was just a magnificent bit of punctuation to the story that was this battle. Sojo dying not just from being cut down, but in the pursuit of pulling even to Kunishigi, even while on the verge of death, is very in character and ties back to him telling Daruma the sorcerer to stick to his path for his entire lifetime. Say what you will about Sojo, but his dedication fueled him to the end. The conclusion of his character was a solid one, and while the lack of Sojo's corpse being shown to us makes me somewhat skeptical that he won't return in some form or fashion, I also think it's completely fine if chapter 18 was the last we'd seen of his character. His arc was brief, but it was officially written, and the effect he's had on Chihiro so far seems to be a lasting one both physically and mentally. The arm he took from him is still gone, and I don't see it coming back for a while, and Chihiro still seems to grapple with the destructive power of the blades when not wielded by a righteous person, as Sojo was able to kill the Kamunabe and put their awesome power on display firsthand. To Takeru Hokazono as an author and Kagurabachi as a story, I say congratulations and thank you for making such a good villain so efficiently and concisely. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more Kagurabachi content, subscribe, hit the bell, and check out this other Kagurabachi video I did where I talked about how it's been living up to the hype and more. I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.